and share my screen. There we go. So you should all now be able to see a nice view of Delphi with, it says on the screen, ancient sites of mainland Greece. Can you all see that? Can you all hear me? Wave if you can. Jolly good. Excellent. Fantastic. Right. Well, welcome to our second lecture in the series. And today we're going to be visiting the ancient sites of mainland Greece. Now, quite unashamedly, I'm keeping it to mainland Greece and really mainly the area of the Peloponnese, Athens and Delphi. So we're not going to the north of Greece, to Macedonia, Thessaly, and we're not going to visit any of the islands this evening because quite simply, there's enough material for us to cover in just staying within the Peloponnese. Also, I'm limiting myself to the ancient sites, the classical sites, pre-classical sites, but next week's lecture will be dedicated to the post-classical sites, so Byzantine sites. We'll go and see some of the beautiful towns and cities of the Peloponnese, and also go and visit downtown Athens. So it was just a way of dividing the material because it was just too much to cover in one single talk. So forgive me if I'm not covering everything in this talk. So Greece, of course, the birthplace of democracy, Western philosophy, Western literature, historiography, and therefore quite justly to be considered the birthplace of Western civilization. Now, I'm going to give you a tour through some of the wonderful sites that we can go and visit in mainland Greece. But I ought to say, give a slight disclaimer here. I'm not a trained archaeologist. I'm not a historian. I'm not a tour guide in Greece. But what I can bring to these sites is very much the eyes of somebody who visits these places for the first time. What is there to see? What is there something to marvel at for the first time visitor to mainland Greece? Of course, some of you might well have visited these places, in which case I hope it will count as an enjoyable and pleasant revision lesson for you. So I hope it will be worthwhile and enjoyable, you know, with whichever experience you bring to it. So Greece is full of temples, theatres, and all manner of archaeological sites. And we sometimes forget what the purpose of visiting these sites is. Is it to wonder at the building skills? Or do we like to visit the museums and marvel at the beautiful sculptures, the beautiful vases? Do we want to use it as a revision lesson for our classical history? Or do we just want to enjoy the scenery and marvel at the beautiful places that the Greeks built their cities? Well, to be quite honest, I think all of those reasons are absolutely valid for visiting Greece. And I think everybody brings their own experience to these wonderful sites. And every experience that we bring to it is just as valid as another. There's no right reason or wrong reason to be visiting these sites. So the sites that we're going to visit in today's talk are mainly located in the Peloponnese area of Greece. We'll also go and visit Athens. We have to really, because Athens is where, if you travel to Greece, invariably you will fly in and out of Athens. And we also have to mention Delphi, because without a visit to Delphi, I would say no visit to Greece is complete. Many of the sites in the Peloponnese you will know, you'll recognize their names. Some of them you won't know, it doesn't matter. I'll explain their relevance to you. Let's also look at the topography of the Peloponnese. As I think you can see from this map, there are not many large cities or towns. Probably Patras is the largest, Sparti and Corinth. Those are the really large towns. The rest of the Peloponnese is really quite remote. It's very mountainous countryside, and a lot of it, as you can tell from the green on this Google map, is forested. Most of it with these beautiful umbrella pines, but some of it down here near Kalamata with beautiful olive groves and so forth. There are some bare mountains around Sparta, but I think just the journey itself throughout the Peloponnese is transporting. It very much takes you back in time to these wonderful places that you visit. And I think before we actually go and visit the sites, I think I should say a very great thank you to Hazel and also to her daughter Helen, who are with us tonight, because many of these sites and the photographs that you'll see in my talk come from a journey that we made together last October to go and visit these beautiful places. And it was very much Hazel's idea to, she very much put the itinerary together. So thank you, Hazel, for your input to the itinerary that I'm going to show you during the talk. So let's make a start with the earliest site. And we're going to go and visit Mycenae here. All of you will have heard of Mycenae, and you'll have heard of the civilization, the Mycenaeans. Who were they? Well, the Mycenaean civilization was the last phase of the Bronze Age of ancient Greece. So to put dates to that, it corresponds to the period roughly between 1600 and 1100 BC. It represented the first advanced civilization on mainland Greece. It had an urban organization, works of art, and most importantly, a system of writing. They were known for their palatial structures. Their towns were ruled, or cities, I should say, were ruled over a king who very often lived in a palace. And furthermore, their religion included deities who would later become part of the Olympic pantheon. So, according to legend, Mycenae was founded by Perseus, who was king of nearby Tiryns and who was famous for having beheaded the Gorgon Medusa. The site of Mycenae is located on what we call an acropolis site, which basically means a hill, located 270 meters above sea level in the northeast corner of the Argive plain. And this was typical of the Mycenaean civilization. They tended to locate their cities on the tops of hills. The other most famous example, of course, is Athens. The Acropolis of Athens, which we'll come to visit later, was originally a Mycenaean settlement, a Mycenaean city. Also, most importantly, the Mycenaean civilization is important for being the originator of Linear B. Linear B was an alphabet. It provides the first written record of the Greek language, and therefore the first written record of any Indo-European language. So this is one of the tablets that was found in Mycenae. It's in the museum there. And what you're looking at, these symbols here, each symbol represents a sound, a syllable. So not a whole word. So they're not pictograms, but they represent a part of a word, either a consonant or a vowel, or a consonant and a vowel combined. Also, Mycenae was famous as being the home of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the king of Mycenae, and he was also the leader of the Achaean expedition to Troy. Now, if you remember from your story of the Iliad, Agamemnon was the brother of Menelaus. Menelaus was the king of Sparta, whose wife Helen had been abducted by Paris of Troy. And it was Agamemnon who agreed to gather this expedition and set sail for Troy. Furthermore, of course, Agamemnon's wife was Clytemnestra, and she was the sister of Helen herself. So he had a double reason to wage this expedition. However, there is another connection between Mycenae and Troy. And we'll talk more about Troy. We've got a lecture after Christmas on the archaeological sites of northwestern Turkey, and Troy, of course, is going to feature in that. But nevertheless, what is the connection between Mycenae and Troy? Well, of course, one of the connections is Agamemnon. The other connection is the archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, who began excavating in Mycenae in 1876. Prior to excavating Mycenae, he had been excavating Troy. He'd spent the previous 4 years excavating the site of Troy. I think it's important to say here that Heinrich Schliemann is not really a hero in archaeology. He's very much used as a lesson to first-year archaeological students at university in how not to go about an excavation. His motive very often was to look for treasure, in that indeed that's what he'd found in Troy. There's a famous photograph of his wife actually dressed in the treasure, supposedly the gold crown of Helen and so forth. But here in Mycenae, just to return to Greece for the moment, he famously found the death mask of Agamemnon, which has justly been described as the Mona Lisa of history, and is now on display at the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And when he found it, he famously wrote a telegram, a cable, to the King of Greece saying, "I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon." Nowadays, of course, there is a doubt firstly as to whether this is Agamemnon, secondly as to whether it actually belonged in the grave that Schliemann was excavating at the time, and thirdly, of course, it's quite possible, quite probable that Schliemann actually buried it there himself so that he was able to find it. Indeed, modern archaeologists, they say that it is certainly Mycenaean, this mask, but they think it predates Agamemnon, probably by 3 centuries. So probably, unfortunately, is not the death mask of Agamemnon. The other thing for which the Mycenaeans were famous was they were known as being the Cyclopean or Cyclopean builders. What do I mean by that? Basically, they used huge blocks of stone that only could have been moved by the mythical Cyclops. This photograph here is the Lion's Gate, famous Lion's Gate at Mycenae, so called because it has this lovely carving of lions over the lintel. There's lots of speculation on what the lions represent and where they came from. It wasn't actually for that reason that I wanted to show you this photograph, but rather it was for the building technique of the Mycenaeans. As I said, they used very massive blocks of stone, particularly at the base of their walls. The higher ones are a little bit smaller, but the ones at the bottom, massive blocks. But also, unfortunately, in this photo, I don't have it would be nice to have a person to give you some idea of scale, but these vertical pillars of the doorway are about 2 meters high, meaning that the lintel above the doorway is probably about 2.5 meters across. But so it's not an arch in the sense that we would think of an arch, but if you look at what's going on above the lintel, it is what archaeologists, architects would call a corbelled arch. If we take the frieze of the lions out for the moment, you'll notice that the so-called corbels above the lintel form an arch in their sense. And in doing so, they take the weight off the lintel. And in this way, the Mycenaeans solved the problem of an arch, of a doorway. In fact, if I go to the next slide, this is the so-called tomb of Agamemnon. It's what we call a tholos tomb, a sort of beehive shape. You'll see very much the same kind of thing. Absolutely massive stone here, the lintel over the doorway, and this, as I say, this corbelled arch above it. This photo has some people in it to give you some idea of the sheer scale of the size of this building. So, moving away from Mycenae now to nearby Tiryns. Tiryns is only about 10 kilometers away. Not as famous in history, but still a very worthwhile place to visit, with these wonderful walls and palatial structures up on the top. And I think a visit to Tiryns is really just to marvel at how on earth they built such massive walls back in the Bronze Age. Well, moving away from the Mycenaeans now, I want to take you to another beautiful place on the Argive plain, a place called Epidavros. Now, it's in what's known as the Argolid territory today, all of this territory around here, but it was not technically considered so until the time of the Romans. Now, in classical times, Epidavros was the home of the sanctuary to the god Asclepius. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing, and Epidavros was the place that you went to if you were suffering from an ailment and you needed to be cured. So the site of Epidavros, there is the sanctuary to Asclepius. There are also the houses where people could stay when they came to be cured, places where the priests lived. And there is also a curious, the actual sanctuary of Asclepius was probably the place where people actually went to get cured. And it was none other than a snake pit, because the cure for the ancient Greeks was nothing less than subjecting yourself, staying inside a pit of snakes, fortunately usually harmless snakes, and allowing these snakes to crawl over you, and they would draw out the evil spirit that was afflicting you and causing your pain or your illness. And hence, just to go back to the previous slide, the symbol of Asclepius is the rod and also the snake. And of course, this is the caduceus that is still used by the medical fraternity throughout the world today, a symbol of many medical associations and so forth. So historically, that was the importance of Epidavros. But today, as you can see, the site is quite ruined, or at least this part of the site is largely in ruins. So I think what people really go to visit is the absolutely astonishing theatre at Epidavros. It is the most complete and the largest Greek theatre existent in the world today. It was constructed in the 4th century BC, and the original 34 rows of seats are these ones here. These were the ones constructed by the Greeks. And in Roman times, a further 21 seats were added up here. So in total, it seats 14,000 people. It has largely not been restored. It is very much as it would have been in Roman times. This photograph here, I'm sitting right up at the very top and looking down onto the stage, or in Greek terms, what was called the orchestra. And one of the most extraordinary features about this theatre is its acoustic properties. And in fact, almost all of the tour groups do this. So this here, obviously, little tour group has just arrived. This photograph was taken early in the morning. I think I got there as soon as the theatre opened. I think I was the first one in. And what the tour groups tend to do, the tour leaders, tour guides, they disperse their groups to tell them to go and sit on the seats around here, and then they drop a coin onto the stage. And it's quite extraordinary. You can hear the penny drop right up here in the 34th row. Quite extraordinary acoustic properties. And about 15 years ago, a study was done here, and they discovered that it was actually the carving of the limestone seating that filters out the lower frequency sounds, the murmuring sounds, and it amplifies the higher sounds, the penny dropping, but also the sounds of the actors reciting their lines. And finally, of course, the other beautiful thing about this theatre is the view, the beautiful view over the mountains and these beautiful umbrella pines here in the background. So certainly I think it's one of the great highlights for anybody's visit to the Peloponnese. I'd like to take you now to Nemea, a relatively minor site, but not far away. And at Nemea, we go to visit a beautiful, the remains of a very fine temple of Zeus. You can see built to the Doric order. And it's in a very lovely setting, I have to say. And one of the lovely things about it is that almost certainly you will be on your own visiting it. There won't be anybody else around. And that's what's so lovely about it, is just to take in the setting of these vineyards, the olive groves, and the mountains in the background. But I think probably the most interesting thing about Nemea is the relatively recently discovered stadium, which is about a kilometer distant from the temple that I just showed you. It's to all intents and purposes, it's a standard Greek stadium. The audience would have sat around the outside. You can see here still the start line. This is where the judges would have sat. But here there is a tunnel that leads from the changing rooms to the stadium itself. And herewith the tunnel. And this is quite extraordinary. It dates from the 4th century BC. We know that because there is graffiti on the wall on the inside, which tells us that. But look at it. Whoever said the ancient Greeks didn't know the arch? They did. Here is the proof. This vaulted arch form of a tunnel underneath the seating to the stadium. So very, very interesting site, I think, for that. Not far away from Nemea is the city of Corinth. Nowadays, of course, it's famous for the Corinthian Canal, joining the Ionian Sea off to the west and the Saronic Gulf here between Athens, famously, of course, cut out in the 19th century. It didn't exist in the time of the Greeks. And Corinth, of course, is also well known because of the 2 letters of St. Paul to the Corinthians in the New Testament. But prior to that, of course, it was one of the most important cities of ancient Greece. It had a population of about 90,000 in 400 BC. The other importance of the city of Corinth was that it was the founder of several important Greek colonies, namely, of course, Corfu was also a colony of Corinth. But I think for those of you who have visited Sicily, it was also the parent city of Syracuse in Sicily, the Corinthians arriving in Sicily in 734 BC. In the Peloponnesian War, it was aligned with Sparta in the war against Athens and the Delphinian League. This, I haven't got terribly much to say about this, but it's a rather lovely vase from the museum in Corinth with a nice lion, an owl and a bull. I'm afraid I can't tell you much more than that, but I thought it was a rather lovely photo to put it in. Corinth was completely destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC, and it was then uninhabited for about 100 years until it was refounded by Julius Caesar in 44 BC. And thenceforth, it became a famous and important town under the Romans. This here are the Roman baths in the city. But of course, most famously, the Apostle Paul visited the city. That was in 49 or 50 BC, AD rather. And he lived here for 18 months. Then, of course, he traveled away and subsequently he wrote his letters to the Corinthians. So an important site and one that's very worthwhile visiting. I want to take you now to Sparta, down in the south of the Peloponnese. to so sort of heading down the motorway here. So Sparta is what we know it as. Sparti is what it's known as in Greek. And one of the astonishing things about Sparta is just how little of this very famous place there is left. That doesn't mean to say it's not worth visiting, because nearby there's a fabulous Byzantine town of Mistra, which we're going to talk about next week. But the ancient Greek town of Sparta, there's really very little there. Why? Well, for the reason that Sparta was more a collection of villages than a city itself. And Lycurgos, the architect of the warlike Spartan constitution and society, famously declared, "It is men, not walls, that make a city." And in fact, much of Sparta was actually constructed out of wood, and henceforth it has been lost. There is a very nice theatre actually at Sparta, and unfortunately I don't have a photograph of it. But suffice to say, not terribly much remaining, but certainly a lovely site and very much worth visiting. Very much in contrast to Olympia, which is the largest of all the archaeological sites in the Peloponnese. And I think it's also possibly the loveliest of all the archaeological sites in Greece. Olympia is in the west of the Peloponnese, in the fertile Alphios Valley. This is the Alphios Valley here, in the middle of Arcadia. Now, you'll have heard of Arcadia, and it lives up to its name. It's thickly wooded hills that just roll on for miles and miles around. I think it's also important to say that we should clarify, we are not talking about Mount Olympus here. Mount Olympus is in the north of Greece, near to Thessaloniki, and in the area that's called Thessaly. So don't get the two confused. Mount Olympus and Olympia, quite different things. Also, I've put the two on the same map. In a short while, I'm going to talk about a nearby site, Basai. We'll come to that in a short while. So remember it while we're on this slide. Olympia, however, is of course most famous for being the birthplace of the Pan-Hellenic Games. And it was also famous for being for the cult of Zeus. In fact, it boasts a splendid Doric, or it boasted rather, I should say, a splendid Doric temple to the god, which was once as large as the Parthenon. Not very much left of it today, just this single column remaining. But it was here where the cult statue was held, and also where the Olympic flame was kept alight in the time between the Olympic Games. But what I think you'll also notice is that the site of Olympia, there are these beautiful olive trees and oak trees and so forth. It's a very green site, lots of shade, and very, very, very beautiful. But nevertheless, I think the focus of almost everyone's visits will be a visit to the 200-meter track of the stadium itself. So around the outside, this is the auditorium where the audience would have sat. We can still see where the judges' thrones would have been. This was the tunnel, the entrance into the stadium through which the competitors would have entered. The start line is somewhere up at this end, and still today we can still see the finish line of the race. And in fact, what many tour guides do with their groups is they organize a mini race somewhere like here, and see who will be the first to cross the finish line here, which is a lot of fun. Quite extraordinarily, this stadium was not excavated until the 1940s. In fact, it was during the Second World War that it was excavated by the Germans. But it's quite extraordinary to think, you know, when you stand there in the middle of this stadium, you are standing in the site of the original Olympic Games. So quite a moving experience. So in my map, a few slides ago, I mentioned the site of Bassae. Bassae is quite an extraordinary place, and the only thing that is there is a temple, a wonderful Doric temple to the god Apollo. And I say that it's near to Olympia, but it's actually about 2.5 hours drive away. And you drive right up into the hills. And when you get there, it's almost a bit disappointing because all there is this huge marquee. It looks like a sort of wedding marquee in the middle of nowhere. But you step inside the marquee and you come across this wonderful temple, which is being restored. And then hence the reason for the marquee, which is protecting it from the elements, and including this huge gantry that you can see here, which is for moving the restored stones into place. And you can see also the scaffolding that holds it in place, rather like a sort of dental, what's it called? One of those dental braces, because what they're doing is they are underpinning the foundations here. Otherwise, there would be a danger that the whole temple would just topple over. But nevertheless, quite a worthwhile place to visit, I think. And one of the most extraordinary things is that it was entirely forgotten about until the 18th century, when it was rediscovered by a Frenchman who was rebuilding some villas nearby. And he saw it up in the distance. He went up and he looked at it and discovered it. Poor guy, though, a few days later, he went to revisit it. And in doing so, he was surprised by some bandits and murdered. And it wasn't until the 19th century that it was rediscovered again by the English, who, I'm afraid to say, took away the beautiful frieze of the temple. And the frieze now, needless to say, is in the British Museum. Well, moving away from the Peloponnese now, I'd like to take you to visit Delphi up here. By far the most famous archaeological site in the whole of Greece, and quite rightly so. It is the most visited archaeological site of all. It's about a 2.5 hour journey from Athens, so it's quite possible to do it in a day trip. Although it's also very nice to stay the night near Delphi and to make a whole day of it. So why go and visit there? What's the importance of it? Well, as you'll remember, it was the most important oracle in the Greek world. In ancient times, it was known as Pytho, after the serpent Python, who was the son of Gaia and who was believed to dwell in a nearby chasm. Python was later slain by the young Apollo, who arrived in the form of a dolphin, hence the name Delphi. And thereafter, the Pythian Games were held in commemoration of Apollo slaying the snake. And it thereafter became the one of the most important sanctuaries in the whole of the ancient world. But of course, with all these visitors bringing wealth to the city, Delphi became an enormously wealthy place. And that's actually what made it vulnerable. It made it vulnerable to the rivalries between, especially in the struggle between Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BC. And then later, Philip of Macedon, he invaded southern Greece in 338 BC. And by that time, Delphi's role was essentially over. Under the Macedonians and later the Romans, the role of the oracle became increasingly domestic. So whereas before leaders had gone to the oracle to ask them whether they should go to war or to battle, nowadays people, or after in Macedonian times, people went there to ask for advice on marriages, on loans and domestic things and so forth. And then, of course, once the Greek Empire, the Byzantine Empire became Christian, thereafter these pagan oracles no longer served any purpose, and Delphi really passed into history. It's built on the southwest slope of Mount Parnassus here, this lovely mountain up here, and this provides a beautiful backdrop for the theatre, and also looking out over to the valley. So beautiful views from here. And looking in the other direction, here's a reason to stay the night up in Delphi with the sunset down over here. This actually here is the Peloponnese. It's looking as far away as the Peloponnese. So beautiful views from Delphi. And finally, of course, I think we have to say something about Athens itself. This here, of course, is the Acropolis in Athens. In Mycenaean times, the area of the Acropolis was a fortified citadel with Cyclopean walls enclosing a royal palace and a temple to the cult of Athena. But it was the oracle at Delphi, actually, which prophesied that the Acropolis should remain the province of the gods and unoccupied by, or largely unoccupied by, human beings. Then, following the sacking of Athens by the Persians in 480 BC, a great rebuilding program took place, initiated, of course, by Pericles, and almost everything that you see on the Acropolis today dates from the mid-5th century BC. And there it remained largely unchanged until the time of Justinian, when these places were converted to buildings used for Christian worship. The Parthenon itself, the great temple here, was part of Pericles' scheme. And this too underwent similar changes. It became a Byzantine church, then later a Frankish cathedral, and later a Turkish mosque, until, of course, famously, when Athens was besieged by the Venetians in 1687, it became a gunpowder store. And then, of course, a fire ignited the gunpowder and blew the roof of the Parthenon to smithereens. Much of the Parthenon was designed by an architect called Iktinos, and he employed all of the techniques that we talked about in our summer series on Greek temples in Sicily. The idea of slight curvature of the steps of the temple, the slight widening of the gaps between the columns, bowing out of the columns, and so on and so forth. And the other thing that he did in the Parthenon is that he employed the ratio of 9:4. So the length of the width is a ratio of 9:4. The ratio of the width to the height was also a ratio of 9:4, and so on and so forth. There's lots of mathematical treatises written on these ratios. The part of the Parthenon that is missing, of course, is the beautiful frieze. Much of it is in the British Museum today, and some of it is in the Acropolis Museum. And finally, of course, it's not the only temple in Athens. Close to the Agora, there is a beautiful temple to Hephaestus, which is the most complete Greek temple that we have remaining today. Again, built to the Doric order, beautifully complete. This is also one of the early buildings of Pericles' program. Does have to be said, though, I think, for anybody who has visited Agrigento or Paestum or so forth in Italy, that the temple of Hephaestus is really pocket-sized. It's a shame we don't have a person in this photograph, but it's really quite a small temple compared to the Greek temples that you see, for example, in Italy. And then very, very finally, I think it's worth saying something about the fabulous Acropolis Museum. This is a modern museum, modern architecture, built right opposite the Acropolis, opened just almost 20 years ago now. It's a fabulous museum, really, really worthwhile visiting. And of course, it houses beautiful sculptures. All of the sculptures found in this museum are sculptures from the Acropolis itself. So that's very much a whistle-stop tour. Terribly incomplete, I know. There are sites that I didn't take you to visit, museums that I didn't show the inside of, but nevertheless, I hope that gives you some idea of the kind of things that can await you on a visit to the Greek mainland. So if I may now, I'll stop sharing and I can unmute you. There we go. So you should be able to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question. Just put up your hand, wave your arm, shout out loud, or whatever. So, fire away. Don't be shy.
Damien, were the
Terry, yes, nice to see you.
Were the walls in Mycenae made built with slave labour?
I think they must have been. Yes, absolutely. I mean, yes. I mean, of course, all of these civilizations they employed slave labor, and you look at the Mycenaean walls and you think, yes, they would have had to have been. I mean, just to move some of those huge blocks would have taken dozens of slaves. So I think that's a very good point, actually, Terry. Yes. Good. Anybody else for another question?
Is it true? It's Chris here, by the way, Damien.
Hello there, Chris. Nice to see you.
Hiya. That the Oracle of Delphi, which sort of supposed to have given these wise words and predictions, was actually caused by some gas that was coming up through the earth, and they kind of went into a trance of some sort, or maybe they were a bit high on something when they started speaking. I've heard that, but I'm not sure of it.
Yes, I don't know about. Well, yes, there is a gas actually. I mean, what it actually was originally was a spring, but yes, you're quite right. It did emit some kind of gas. But of course, the people that actually interceded for the oracle were the priestesses, and you're quite right. They did go into some kind of trance, and this is how they foretold the fortune of whoever came to ask the question. Most famously, of course, their answers were very, very non-committal. They didn't give a very definite answer. I mean, the famous example of this is Croesus, when he visited from Asia Minor, and he asked the oracle, he said, should I go to battle against the Persians? And the answer that they gave him was, if you go into battle against the Persians, a great empire will be destroyed. And he went into battle against the Persians. And of course, what he didn't understand, that the great empire that would be destroyed would be his own, and the Persians were victorious. So yes, it was a very dubious way of deciding the fortune. Yes. Yeah. So thank you, Chris. Good question. Yeah. Anybody else?
Damon,
Hello there, Angela. Yes.
Hi. So is the Peloponnese really very much the greatest concentration of classical sites in Greece, or?
It is. Yes. Yes. And very much so.
Presumably that did it sort of the population there, and possibly because it was so near the sea, it was a great attraction. You know, it's surrounded almost by water, wasn't it? So.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, for sure, there are also. I mean, I haven't talked at all about Crete, but you're absolutely right to say it is the largest concentration, because I think it's true to say that the other classical sites throughout Greece are very much spread out on islands, on Crete, and so on and so forth. So the Peloponnese, for anybody that's interested in this kind of thing, very much represents the kind of honeypot of the places to visit. Yes. So thank you, Angela. Yes.
Yeah, go on.
Hello there. Yes.
Hi. You said about Corinth, about how it was destroyed by the Romans in 146 BC. But then Julius Caesar came along 100 years later. Why did he inhabit it? Was it for strategic?
To be absolutely honest, I don't know the reason. I mean, I think it was just the Roman advance through Greece and through the Roman Empire. But I don't know the specific reason actually for why he took over Corinth. Possibly also because it was a strategic site. It was on this isthmus between the Peloponnese and Athens as well, quite possibly. But I couldn't tell you the absolute reason. But nevertheless, a very valid question. Thank you. Yes.
Damien.
Anybody else?
Damien.
Ruth. Oh, hello there.
Yeah.
Nice to see you.
Hello
Yes.
There. That was quite a wide-ranging area that you covered. If you were doing that as a tour, would you concentrate it just on the Peloponnese, and you wouldn't do perhaps a day in Athens, or would you include the Oracle at Delphi as part of a tour?
Now that's a very good question, Ruth. Because yes, it is. So last year, Hazel and I, we crisscrossed the whole of the Peloponnese, and we did some incredible drives. But I think Hazel will back me up and say that there were some days when it was almost a little bit too much. So, for example, I mean, to visit Basai really would be too much. And we also visited places which I didn't include in the talk. So, for example, Hector's palace down near Pylos. Yes, we would very much take a selection of those sites. But you see, for example, Mycenae is very easy to visit. Epidavros is very easy to visit. Sparta is very easy to visit. And Delphi, I think you have to visit that. So we would visit all of those places. And I think also you have to have a day in Athens. Athens can be noisy. It can be tough, but I think you have to have a day at the Acropolis. Absolutely. But having said that, the roads down between Athens, down through Corinth and through Mycenae down to Sparta is a good road. So that particular road is easy to travel. But nevertheless, that's a leading question, Ruth. So thank you for bringing it up. Yes.
But Damien,
Yes.
You were the driver on those roads, and some of those roads, Helen, remember, They were corkscrew roads. I mean, they were fantastic. You did a great job of driving.
Well, yes, and that's also the reason, Hazel, we did it in a car.
Yeah.
I think to do it in a minibus wouldn't be quite so much fun. But we had a lot of fun, didn't we? We stopped off and we took photographs of the mountains, and I hope that next week I'll be able to show you some of the photo stops that we did along the way. So
well, that was very enjoyable. Thank you very much for the re-trip.
Thank you. Well, again, thank you for designing the itinerary that we went on.
No problem. No problem.
Yes, good.
Just one other question, Damien. It's many, many years since I went to some of those sites, and at that time, there seemed to be a tendency for any artifacts that had been found there tended to all be taken back to the main museum in Athens, which has obviously had a wonderful new museum fairly recently. And I just wondered to what extent that was still the case in Greece, or whether they had now developed museums at the site so that, you know, their own artifacts tended to stay in location, you know.
I think it's true to say, actually, there are very nice museums at all those sites,
right.
Particularly at Olympia. There's a beautiful museum there. The museum at Sparta is a little bit small, a little bit out of the way. But you'll remember that, Hazel, won't you? I mean,
and Nemea also had a very nice one.
Nemea, yes, fantastic. Yes, thank you for reminding. That was a great one. Yes, wasn't it? So yes, all the museums are worthwhile visiting on those trips. Yes,
except for Basai doesn't have a museum.
No, Basai doesn't have anything, does it?
Just a tent.
Just a tent. Yes. Never mind. All right. Any last questions before we go off and have our supper?
I've got one last comment, Damien, if I may.
Yes,
Going back to the lady about where was the good places to go. When we went on our own, and I was driving around, and we did Epidaurus and we did Corinth and so forth. And I insisted we went to Tyrannus, if that's how you pronounce it. And when we got there, Rosemary took one look at those walls and she said, "I'm out." She said, "If you want to go around there, you can go on your own." So she looked at those huge blocks of stone, and that it's such a forbidding looking place, isn't it? That
it is.
I went round on my own. So that might not be everybody's first choice.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, and actually, Rosemary was right, because the most significant thing about Tiryns is looking at the walls from the outside, I think. So so thank you, Rosemary, for backing me up on that.
Wise decision, wasn't it?
Yes.
Well, thank you for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
Damien?
Yes,
May I just ask one quick question about next week, since you're covering the Byzantine
Tina,
Empire?
yes, nice to see you, Tina. Yes.
Nice to see you too. Are you going to northern Greece, or are you going to stay in the same area regarding the Byzantine Empire?
To be quite honest, Tina, I haven't actually decided what we're doing next week.
Okay.
We might go to northern Greece if I have time and if I can find the photographs. So next week, but anyway, it's a good question, because it leads me on to what we're doing next week. So I want to take you to Mistras, to Nafplio. I want to show you around Athens a little bit. And I want to take you to Monemvasia, which I think is a lovely town. And I also want to take you to the beautiful monasteries of Meteora. If we have time, we'll also go and visit Thessaloniki as well, Tina.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Is it a special request? If there is, then I'll try and visit.
No, not at all. I've been to Thessaloniki. In fact, I was born not far from there.
Right. Yeah.
Right outside of Kastoria, where the lake is. So it just has so many Byzantine sites, that part of the world. That's all.
It does, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, we'll try and fit it in. We'll do.
Well, not to worry. I think the itinerary sounds quite full, and I have been there, so I was just curious.
Right. Okay. Well, tune in next week to find out if we actually make it there or not.
We will. We will. Thank you.
Otherwise,
Thank you very much,
thank you
Damien.
all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Have
you,
a
Damien,
nice
very
week.
much.
Stay
Bye.
safe, stay warm,
Bye.
and
Bye-bye.
take
Bye,
care.
Damien.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye to all of you. Bye bye.